which starts with the rejection of normativity, if normativity is understood as a transcendental category. I see it as ethical in part because I want to say we could reformulate this as contextualization and critical resource. So, for instance, when you talk about Skinner eventually saying, you know, we have to abandon that. And by the way, one interesting point about those essays in the late 60s, when he argues for a caste-centered position, his interlocutors are political theorists. In fact, he's not talking about historians. He's talking about the kind of casual use of past resources for.
In your present, do you seek them out? Do you not seek them out? Is your audience those in this room, or is it humanity as a whole, or is it some future public yet to be born?
I can tell you what Marty once said about this, but it's kind of embarrassing because we were talking about, you know, I don't know, when you're young and you struggle with things and you it's sort of like, can I have a political impact as an intellectual historian? Am I doing politics, right? Am I just like throwing politics by the wayside? You know, those questions that don't stop bothering you once you've written a couple books, or don't, or do. But how to figure it out? You start thinking of yourself as doing politics as you're writing, and I think that's Sam's point. Obviously, is how do we think about that, right? And when I asked you, this is a long time ago, and you said, yeah, the New York Times it doesn't matter if you don't get reviewed in the New York Times anymore, because it's basically Dennis from Scarsdale who are reading, you know, like the Brick Review. But at this point, that's who's reading it. So, and now we know the New York Times, the books are reviewed by journalists. So, if you actually read book reviews, they don't really tell you very much often, right? Or you don't know if you can trust them, for the very reason that they are not scholars, so they don't know the debates, and they're writing for a larger public. And the question of whether that's good or bad, it seems it has to be good, because it makes books accessible that might not otherwise be. On the other hand, also certain books get reviewed that certain books are not going to get reviewed at all because they don't appeal to a larger public, which is not the case. Obviously, if they reviewed LeCapra's first book and even Marty's first book. So I guess I would just say that let all the flowers bloom, a very Marty sentiment. I think in the sense that we all have to think of ourselves as James said, as speaking to the world that we live in one way, shape, or form. But how we do that is a choice that you make. And I mean, some of us just don't have the talent. I mean, I'm speaking for myself. I don't have the talent. I can't write for a larger public. I don't know how to do. It's a skill, and some of us have mastered it, and some of us can't do it, and I can't. I don't know how to do it, and that's, you know, so I'll never be able to do it. But it doesn't mean that I'm not trying very hard to engage in all kinds of political, you know, ethical debates about what it means to write history. But
in which that takes place is teaching, and I think that still does happen in a lot of places. Of course, it's devalued in a lot from the very institutions in terms of how the humanities have been turned into boutiques in many places. So I think that is another space that where, yes, we can keep the flame alive as best we can. I do think there are some. I'm a person who has tried to dabble a bit in some public writing too, and I do think there are some new spaces that, even as there's kind of a decline of the legacy media in some ways, or what did you say, Dennis from Scarsdale? Oh, okay. But there are so there's sort of also a proliferation of kind of intellectually oriented magazines that deal with contemporary politics, but also with ideas, and have pretty robust book reviews programs in place. So there's, I think, some interesting crossover that is developing in those spaces as well.
The real origin of the anecdote, I had lunch with an old graduate school friend of mine, Barry Bruin, who was an editor for the New York Times Book Review for many, many years. And he told me that the target audience was that, now famous dentist in Scarsdale. And I remember responding to him by saying, why don't you just try for the orthodontist? I think we're all aware of how many different audiences, how many different public. This is a very a constant issue, not only for us, but generally for scholars in the university academy as opposed to more general. And some people make the attempt to bridge and others don't. I want to go back to the issue of modesty, because I think that's very important. It seems to me that intellectual history is, by definition, a training in a kind of modesty, because we've chosen in a way to spend our time with people who are smarter than us, people who are clearly, in some ways, intellectual legislators. So if you're reading Marx, Freud, Hegel, Nietzsche, you can go through the whole list, you realize that you are commenting on them, you are learning from them, you are somehow in their shadow, and it gives you a sense that you have inherited something, or at least are working with ideas that you have not created. So it's a kind of, I think, way to avoid the arrogance of some kinds of presentist thinkers who think they're inventing wheels, that we know those wheels have been turning for a long time. Having said that, we also, I think, and this comes back to the issue of the present versus past, that the present is itself, in a very complicated way, produced by a past which is still present. So it's not an either or. And so it's a question of how we somehow think of that relationship, and how the past still either haunts or informs or challenges the present. And all of those are different relationships. And so we're involved in that kind of, I would say, dialogic relationship, if I use one of Dominic O'Caffer's terms, with the past. And then we're also, I think, in a way, Hegelians, or Gadamerans perhaps, in the sense that we know that the truth of the present is, in a sense, an accumulated, we might say, complicated mixture of truths and falsehoods of the past. That every position that we've accomplished, we've somehow encountered, has within it a grain of truth as well as perhaps surmountable falsehood. So that our truth is, in a way, incorporative. It's one that is not simply ex nihilo, but includes what has been said and what has been disproven and what has been misunderstood from the past. So what this gives us is a kind of, once again, humility, a modesty, a sense that our truth is always indebted to the mistakes and falsehoods of the past, as well as the partial truths. And just to make a sort of final point about that, we're now in this absolutely horrible situation in which the dichotomy between pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli political positions have become utterly polarized, utterly either-orish, utterly in one camp or the other. And I think the training of intellectual history, and there are many other fields that probably do this as well, is to avoid that either-orism, is to see that each side has within it histories, has within it partial truths, has within it something that we may build on to move beyond it. Now, this may not be a dialectical sublation or Aufhebung, but it moves us, I think, beyond that point of simplistic either-orism, which infects not only other intellectual fields, other disciplines perhaps, but also public discourse. So the intellectual is, I think, a very healthy training in the modesty of understanding the complexity of what we're dealing with, and helps us in that sense in the present, and helps us perhaps to move to a better future. So I would just stop with that as a little speech.
Well, I obviously those are large rhetorical questions, and I think the idea is that they don't get answered, but they open up a space for thinking in complex ways about experience. But so I was thinking about the ways that we're talking about experience now in psychodynamic and psychoanalytic theory, and I was really struck actually by the last panel in this discussion, the
This, I think, is also what Marty's book does, because experience is just in that context. And after going through all these modalities of experience, you sort of have a sense of how limited our present version is, and also our present historical version compared to the scale of what could be known in there. And I think that's really what I was left with the book, is both a sort of encyclopedia of a number of different kinds of experience I hadn't thought of, a set of chords, to come back to my previous comment, that overlap a bunch of them, where all of a sudden I can link up, Ankersmit and Schleiermacher and somebody else and sort of think what the parallels are. But also a sense of that sort of surprise, or that book of experience as experience, to come back to the Misapian part again.
Thank you. On how it had all turned out. I could not use my own experience to choose between past and present. My experience did not take me out of the past. As Professor J puts it at one point in Songs of Experience, I was in a bad infinity that may not be so bad after all. But if I sensed that I remained in my own experience as I studied the past, what was the relationship of my experience to my scholarship? It was certainly not to make my own experience matter, or even somehow to contextualize it. As I've thought more and more about this, I have come closer to the idea of scholarship in the Jewish tradition as a substitute for sacrifice. I am convinced that scholarship cannot sustain itself without a sense of the sacred and without sacrifice. Comparing my experience of philosophy, which is an aristocratic sport, and scholarship, again, the idea of sacrifice stands out for me, because scholarship brings you against your limitations at virtually every turn. Hence, I have come to think of the relationship between my experience and scholarship as a writing of my experience into and onto a sacred narrative.
Well, actually, explicitly for David and Anya, and implicitly, at least insofar as the book is a corrective, is you seem to be indicating that something has happened or shifted, unprecedented or not, whereas the realm of experience had been held together by some loose collective. So you could say you had perspectivalism, right? We were talking about this earlier, where things move out and we have different ways of experiencing it, but it comes back to a common center, and we could at least agree upon that, even if it's sort of amorphous. And what you seem to be indicating now is a kind of parallelism, where there's these sense that our experiences don't touch anywhere. So my experience can't be your experience because I didn't have your experience. And I'm wondering whether this diagnosis is correct, whether you think there is that kind of a fault, and whether that means that we really do need a new conceptual apparatus, or either to move to something else, that experience now has become something that we can't really use in any kind of positive way, at least in this moment, or whether there's something to be done. I guess this is where your scholarship on experience might come in, but I wonder how far that'll go. Science fiction, strikes me, won't help at all. It's always telling us to colonize or invent. It's very backwards looking science fiction. Maybe we invent a phone or something, but other than that, it's just like, yeah, let's go colonize a planet. Like, that's a new idea. So anyhow, I'm curious to hear any.
On the Friday morning. And then, it all ended, and my memory was of this great experience in this first section and just dismal experience in the second section. And then the next year I got the evaluations back. And it turned out that in that first section, about half of the students who had been talking the whole time, they loved it. But then there are a lot of people, maybe 30% of the class, had felt alienated and resented that they had to pretend they were part of this great experience, whereas they thought I should have shut up that libertarian and we shouldn't be discussing his stupid ideas. And then the people in the Friday morning just thought this was the greatest thing. They learned so much. It was so wonderful, and I was kind of shocked, because my own experience was something completely the opposite of these evaluations. And so I had to kind of have this idea: do I kind of trust myself in the classroom? Am I missing something completely? Then I went to an institution in Spain, which is literally run like a business, in which you're given numbers, they're weighted across all of your classes. A final evaluation score is put on you for the whole year. That's your number, that's what you're evaluated on. There's a global score for your whole career. And people are basically walk around with these kinds of numbers in their head. And since teaching really mattered for them, because these were their clients and that's how they thought about it, those scores really mattered. And I realized that it put almost all of the teachers there into a kind of manipulative attitude towards their students. And so I developed this notion of, following my own experience, not in the sense of not caring about evaluations, but I would wait, 6 months, try to use those evaluations to kind of hone the experience that I was having in the classroom, rather than dropping essentially my experience and getting into this adversarial relationship with students.
But just as an aside, it was an interesting place of sort of bitterness taking over the debate to some extent that I had not been aware of before I had read that. And just as an aside, I thought that was an interesting place to study of what goes wrong with intellectual debate, or what goes wrong with debate among all people I respected and admired. So at some point I'd love to hear more about it.
We have time for another question? Yes, please.
As historians, and that seems to be vanishing. And in a sense, Alfred Barnes's kind of fantasy of the unmediated art experience is kind of all too actual at this point. But of course, the world is saturated with mediation, but of a very different sort.
Only through his scholarship, but with other means. So what I got from Marty as a PhD supervisor was a lot, as you all know. Patience, generosity, helpfulness, creativity. Well, the list could go on and on. And my dissertation was greatly improved because of his advice. Now, the problem, I couldn't reciprocate. I mean, there's no way I could give the gift back. I mean, because I couldn't be his PhD supervisor. So what I do, I try, after becoming myself a supervisor of other PhD students, I try to imagine the way Marty would behave with these students. And I try as far as I can to be generous with time, helpful. So this is what I call delayed reciprocity. I give the gift back, but not to Marty, to my students. And I hope that in turn they will do the same. So this is, you do good, and then the goodness spreads all over the world, I hope. So this is just a beginning. On the vision book, why it's a takeoff, and the vision book was clearly an inspiration. I'm interested in a minor character in the vision book, whom I'd like to turn into a major character in my own book. This character is the spectator. The spectator, or the figure of the spectator, who made an appearance, but not a full-bodied appearance in the vision book. And I'm interested in the spectator in the context of theater and festival. The contrast between the theater and the festival. I might use the term, I'm interested in the festive imagination. I'm talking about modern French intellectual history, I should have said. I'm doing French history and also Israeli history. I'm from Tel Aviv University, but that's a different area altogether. So in terms of the spectator, there is this difference between the theater spectator, and the festival, or the theater and the festival. The spectator in the theater is a denigrated person. He's isolated. He is passive. He has all these false images in front of him. This is somebody who should be avoided. I'm talking now about a tradition, about intellectual tradition in modern French history. So the spectator is something to be avoided. What should we have instead? A festival. In a festival, we are no longer mere spectators. We are part of a community. We're not isolated. We're active. We're not passive. We take part in the action. And there's no representation. Reality is part of. We are part of reality. There's no intermediacy between us and the reality. So, festival is the solution to this problematic position of the spectator, of the theater, of the spectator in the theater. Now, the festival, I would say, is also a utopian moment. La fête is a utopian moment because this is it has a political, clearly a political aspect, because this is the moment, well, for several reasons. This is the moment or the gate through which we have to pass in order to transform society, the festival. The festival is also a kind of a model of future society. Equality. A festival is an egalitarian moment. And a festival is also an educational moment, a moment to which we educate ourselves to become the future members of this utopian society. So it's quite complicated, but it's all there. And I insist on the utopian dimension of the festival. Where do we find it? Jean-Jacques Rousseau, to begin with. The letter to d'Alembert. Then Antonin Artaud and the theater and its double. And finally, Guy Debord with the Society of Spectators. Just a very few words about each one of them.
Open access to all sorts of data, large data sets, even the entire internet. But the more complex algorithms that we know about nowadays, neural nets, deep learning, they rely on such complicated math, really complicated math, that the outputs of algorithms are actually now opaque in the sense that there's such a complexity and a bigness to the work that they're doing that it results in responses that are intelligible and that seem correct, but you couldn't actually retrace how they're arrived at. And so in this context, I think AI's applications, which are, as we know, are currently largely unregulated, although that's changing, really run across the full spectrum of kind of utopian and dystopian configurations. So on the one hand, we have AI being used to ease access to large amounts of data or information for people who might otherwise not have any access to that. Often marginalized people, vulnerable people. Access to universal translation, which is a huge change. So a lot of things around productivity tools, things like that. But on the other hand, you have kind of this specter of this kind of, through classification, an aim to map the entire Earth on a planetary scale in a way that would then supersede other forms of knowledge. So using satellites from satellites to street sensors to cell phones, it really creates a specter that we hear a lot about in the media, right? About a totalizing regime where there's no more negative or invisible space for action. And so there, I thought one kind of point of contact with Avner, in the sense that it's totally different, but really thinking about what are those spaces for refusal within this regime.
It does seem like a crucial question. I know a lot of what Downcast Eyes did was engage with texts about vision. But nonetheless, there is in there an attempt to say, okay, how can we begin to develop models that also look at visual regimes similarly? And that strikes me as just as crucial, or perhaps more crucial today, as it was then.
Just artificial intelligence, I mean, first of all, you have to think of it in a kind of culturally semantic field way. What is the opposite of natural intelligence? What do we mean by natural intelligence? So then we're back to the, perennial intellectual historical problem. What do you mean by nature? How much is nature always already filtered by culture, by artifice? So it's not an absolute either or. That's one thing. It's on a continuum.
Yeah.
And then the other, what is intelligence? So David Delano, who is, one hopes, finishing his dissertation on animal intelligence as a category, which emerges, at a certain point, late early 20th century, as a way to make a continuum between humans and animals, which the word rationality didn't quite, include. Intelligence itself has a narrow band of meaning. Not the same thing as imagination, all the various other faculties of the mind. Is it moral? No, no. So intelligence itself is only one possible way in which we have a continuum with either animals on the one hand or cyber reality on the other. And it may be that it's too narrow, that there may be other things that are excluded that we still will have when the machines run past us. So that's one point. Icarus is fascinating, Icarus in the body. I mean, I'm always fascinated by the way in which the body weighs us down. Icarus somehow soars above, but he falls. I mean, the kind of constant sense of the soul, the body up, down, low. All of these are metaphors that we use. The body always does come back, but the body itself is always already filtered by culture. So the body is not something which is ahistorical. The body has, as we call it, a history. And yet it is always somehow a counterweight to the other, we might say, contingency of how we exist in the world. It says, no, wait a minute. You can't completely invent it out of whole cloth. There's something prior which, and the most crucial thing in a way is mortality. Human individual bodies are mortal. The species may not be, perhaps, although ultimately it will be. But that's a major aspect of the body. Not simply the body that feels, the body that desires, but also the body that dies. And that aspect, a recent piece I did on the Leib-Körper distinction points to the importance of understanding the body as somehow always already almost dead. So that there's a sense in which we have to see the body as always having that kind of internal consciousness of mortality, which is very crucial as a thing that brings. Now, to come to
fundamental motivating force.
I mean, it is. It's what makes us. That may be the difference between human and animal intelligence. I mean, animals may not really fully understand their mortality. We don't know for sure. On the idea of festival in Spain, I love the idea that both Derrida and Rossier said, no, let's not celebrate the festival too quickly. All that dancing, all the revelry, all the Dionysian frenzy may not get us too far. What do you do when you wake up in the morning? And this you talked about May '68. The other version of that, the dark side of that, is January 6, 2021. And when that happened, I wrote to my friend Jim Clifford, and I said, see what the trouble you got us into by celebrating Kaiwa, Bataille, all these characters who thought that the festival was going to be utopian. It turned out to be pretty dystopian. There was violence, there was revelry, but of the kind that most of us, I think, are repelled by. So these terms are always in play in a kind of very fascinating way. And wherever we go too much in this direction, we pull back and go in the other direction. So.
In French.
Meters. This guy goes riding by, he's now cut off the saddle on his horse, he's bareback, he's got his saber, horse gets shot, the guy survives. My grandfather registers the Spanish flu as a perverse irony that a guy like that fell to the flu, right? And it kind of puts it into a different perspective. When you think about the traumatic situation of 1918, where that just in some ways folded out, kind of schooled out from the overall trauma of those years. But I think about a book that I teach, Vera Britton's Testament of Youth, which is incredible. And she talks about her own grief, and this is before she loses her fiance and the other young men who were so important to her. But she says, like, in a sense, my grief went into the universal grief. And I've taught that several times, but I taught it on Zoom in the context of the COVID crisis, and it never had resonated so deeply with me. And partially it was because my mother broke her hip a week before the lockdown. And she kind of disappeared into a black hole for about 8 weeks, right? No communication. I couldn't see her until she died. About 2 weeks after I finally saw her, I could cross the border into Canada and this kind of thing. And I couldn't help but feel that my personal experience of that trauma was highly mediated by what Vera Britton was talking about, the kind of that sense of a universal grief. It did to see it come to fruition and such a productive and congenial and collegial conversation today. It's wonderful to welcome both Marty and Kathy and their daughter. It's wonderful that you could come. I want to propose a toast, but before I do, I also wanted to ask Alex to say a word. He's going to propose a toast tomorrow, but Alex does want to say a word.
Take toasting very seriously. But I just want to just relish in the experience of being the last Marty J student because Ari Edmondson, my dear friend, could not make it. So just basking in not having the second last, I get to finally be the last. No, but in all seriousness, Warren and I have cooked up an idea for the Journal of History Ideas to have an annual Marty J Prize for a graduate student essay. Protesting is optional; they don't have to be forced to protest. But we wanted to announce it tonight because we thought that birthday shouldn't go by without actually doing things. So, thank you so much.
As a common, move of hibernation in what you could call a winter of theory, and it's from a kind of perspective of intellectual sociology, the form that left-wing intellectualism would be expected to take in the absence of a practical left. So then the question is, what's to be salvaged? And it's really interesting how the kids today are reviving Marx. I think Paul Reiter's translation of Capital coming out, he's a generational Berkeley companion of ours, coming out in fall will be a major event. But I think we do have to go back because even though we are living amongst the wreckage that the generation of 1968 kind of inherited from world events, also some events in which it participated. I think what was so essential about Western Marxism, as Peter's student Edward Bering showing in an article he has out in a forthcoming book, is that from the days of Blue Conscious critique of Kautsky, there was an insistence on avoiding so-called vulgar Marxism. And that seems like something that the revival of Marx, verso-Marxism, I published with verso too, is not avoiding. So the question is how to save from hibernation the sophistication that we did inherit. And if there is a future of this tradition, how can there be a bequest to young people doing the exciting things that Julian has alluded to?
You can say, looking back too, that in some ways Adorno and Benjamin anticipated a lot of the later concerns of the post-structuralists, in particular Adorno's idea that we need to rethink dialectics from the standpoint of the particular, like minima moralia. He talks about retreating, reflecting on the realm of the subjective, or of course in his aesthetic theory, reflecting on the autonomous work of art as critique of Hegel, right? And we see that too, of course, in a lot of post-structuralist thinking, the rejection of the grand narrative, right? And we need to just focus on the small narrative. But I mean, with the post-structuralists, for Habermas, this was a problem because it often came from an anti-modern position, right? So Habermas says we need to rescue a positive concept of modernity to counter the anti-modernism, kind of neo-Heideggerianism, right, of a lot of the French post-structuralists. And so, to me, I think this ends up, this is one of the reasons why Habermas's shift from capitalism to modernity ends up being too optimistic, too bullish, And so, like, even if we go back to Kant's essay, historians, we look back in the past, we see patterns, right? We see patterns. That's one of the basic premises of his theory. And I think we see this too in a lot of this new literature on history of capitalism. Like, I don't know, like Sven Beckert's book on the Empire of Cotton. It's remarkable how he shows these patterns. And you can see they're not progressive. I don't think anyone would dispute the fact that the Industrial Revolution led pretty directly to the spread of cotton plantations across the southern United States. It's a big pattern that we can see, right?
As a space of freedom, as a space of imagination, that criticism itself does not necessarily need to be attached to particular notions of practice. Meanwhile, all the things that I and others have said of kind of the limits of theoretical practice or the normative of, so just to launch into some of the things I want to say about the normative term, sort of, if we were to get the normative formula right, then what? Then it's a question of social articulation. And so social articulation needs to be built into theoretical practice. And so some of the, my interest in not a Foucauldian, but my interest in studying Foucault as a historical figure, that he was someone who was thinking actively throughout his life about how to integrate social practices into criticism. And so the What is Enlightenment essay I reread recently, and so he talks about not wanting to be blackmailed into a celebration of the Enlightenment, or you're condemned to counter-Enlightenment. And Marty has even written recently about the uses and abuses of cultural Marxism, that we also need to think about the counter-Enlightenment dialectically, right? So there's a sense of freedom and open-endedness from theoretical practice that I would want to hold on to, while calling attention to its limits, generational and otherwise. And so I think, my view is that each generation is entitled to make its own mistakes, right? And so I think a critique is appropriate of our teachers and our parents, et cetera, and also to be prepared for, people out on the quad who will be criticizing a panel of 5 white guys sitting at the head of the table. Thinking requires theory. And so she was giving a very dialectical view that theory without practice is ineffective and practice without theory is blind. She never mentions Adorno, but it was that notion that thinking about the pain of the world from the self to the social, they related to very much and saw the value that thinking as theory is an important.
As we know it today is not the only one, and it's no longer the most important one, if it ever was. And I find, like Julian, that when we look for other tables, we often need to bring the message that theory matters, and you can't just be like mindlessly practical. And the balance between theory and practice, as I learned from a book Marty recommended to me by Nicholas Lobkowitz, goes all the way back. And maybe we shouldn't always want a seat at every table, but the really important tables are ones where there's this ongoing struggle about how to have the right theory of society and history joined to some kind of emancipatory struggle. And the critique I was offering is that, like, I came to Berkeley in the mid-90s and there was no more politics. There was just theory, and I quit.
And so as a result, I find in the past 5 years, I'd never been asked in 15 years before, when are you teaching another Marxism course? Now, I'm asked. And in that sense, there's an openness, I think, to theoretical perspectives that introduce new ideas, an openness to exploring under, around, and over the sort of Cold War era theories that might seem reductive. And also, I would say, and here I'm going to plus one you, John, this appreciation for understanding broader patterns in history that help to identify where did some of these things that we take as normal or natural come from? Where did they begin? what were the alternatives that were left behind? So this combination of theory and a kind of broader understanding of history, I'm finding this kind of openness that hasn't been there before. And that, in the midst of all the exhaustion and resignation, feels also like perhaps a dialectical moment of hope here.
You know, the reason I go there is just because it, for her and for the debate then, also within, well, in the Black Panthers, but also in the Black Power movement, was it a real distinction that of nationalism still being an enemy. And I mean, that's something that there's a certain cosmopolitanism in the, in the Frankfurt School. It's awkward. I mean, sometimes with Adorno and what kind of views on, I mean, now their views on this are maybe different, but they're, and seemingly this, going against this sort of view that nationalism was inherently positive, which even not positive in that sense, but but as a good, even in the sort of this time when Black nationalism was coming into growth. And I've been quite surprised actually in the modern, the contemporary debate, because it's, I mean, with the absence of legal scholars like Kimberly Crenshaw and having read a lot of post-colonial works, the reference points are, they're not many footnotes to what people are discussing. If I went long.
And of course, with the centenary last year, I was, pressed into service and went to conference after how to get a Zoom talk. So it's, I mean, first of all, this is extremely high-level stuff that you guys do. I mean, it's very, very impressive. Illumination about where we are on these issues. I'm really, in a way, deeply gratified that the level is so high and people are really touching on important issues. I just want to make two meta points, maybe I'll sort of drift elsewhere. But the first is that in terms of genesis and validity, as a kind of intellectual historical balance or staging of a debate, here we see quite clearly that this subject, Western Marxism, pushes us very quickly away from Genesis towards validity. That no one is really focusing in a kind of Skinnerian way on how to understand the context out of which this works. We immediately race into, is it valid now? What does theory tell us? What is practical implication? So I think that's fascinating. That as intellectual historians, this kind of subject makes us, in a way, whether we want to be included in the company or not, of the theorists we're talking about. It really creates that kind of impetus. And I think in a way, my own trajectory bears witness to this. That's in a way exhilarating. That it's something that intellectual history enables you to do. That's the first thing. This is not to say that Genesis is unimportant. There are lots of, in John's wonderful book on Horkheimer, really gave us a sense of where he came from. Nick's book on the Dutch reception of critical theory, very important book in showing us how it was filtered through that trajectory. And there are lots of new books, and it's amazing. Philip Langhardt's book on Pollock is about to come out in English. There's a big 600-page book on Felix Weil by Hans Ede Gruber, which gives you every footnote to Weil's life. Amazing. So there's a lot of context still to be done, but it's clear that from our point of view, we are engaged in a larger debate. Now, the second point has to do with the historical account. So I think John correctly said we have to understand the history and understand the importance of the historical message of critical theory. It's not eternal, it's not atomic, it's not natural. It's think as, Fred Jameson always said, you have to think historically. Always historicized. But what critical theory gives us, and Walter Benjamin perhaps in particular, is a question, what does that mean? How do we understand history? How do we understand our relationship to it? And what he was very much opposed to was what might be called a straightforward narrative historicism, in which we know you know, where it comes from, the origins, development, you know, as, you know, a sense of the generations that follow. There's a sense of what we might call an organized, rhetorical, hidden white version, tragic or comic, of the way in which we map the territory or narrate the chronology. Benjamin was against that, and he told us what we need to do is actually explode that and then constellate the debris in a new way, figure out how things fit together. And so a piece I did back in 2018, the 50th anniversary of 68, which I did for Rainer Forst's, whatever it's called, in Frankfurt. I talked about 1968 in an expanded field. I used Rosalind Krauss's notion of sculpture in an expanded field, where it's not on the pedestal, it's in relation to stuff around it, the site, other buildings, whatever. And the argument there was that 1968, in the history of the Frankfurt School, has to be put in a kind of tension with 1967. Let us say with the war, the 6 Days War. And even today, of course, that's much more relevant as a kind of point of constellation. But the argument there was kind of, when I looked at it, paradoxical, because the Frankfurt School then, with the sole exception of Erich Fromm, who was no longer a member, was very, very much pro-Israel. There was no question that these were Jews who saw Israel as a haven for the still threatened Jewish population, saw the Arabs, not the Palestinians, as, in a way, even fascists. The private conversation, Nasser, people like that, were considered dangerous, the neo-fascists or real fascists. And when Marcuse went to Jerusalem and spoke with Moshe Dayan after the war, a couple of years after, he said, look, you know, I don't agree with the policies of the settlements, but you have the right to defend yourself. And what this meant was that they were perhaps, and this is said in a blind spot, they were perhaps not as celebratory of the movements in the Third World, as it was then called, towards emancipation. That they had no romance of the Third World, no excitement about Cuba, about North Vietnam, about all of these resistance movements, which were going to be in replacement of the Soviet Union, the locus of redemption. They didn't buy into that. And in a way, that was right. I mean, they didn't buy into the kind of simplistic notion that the Third World would save us. And we know from, unfortunately, the history of those decolonized countries that, you know, it hasn't been such a good story. But of course, it also blinded them to the potential to have something that decentered or de-Europeanized, de-Eurocenterized, whatever you call it, critical theory, which we now see, of course, proceeding at pace. And you know, John's point about the cosmopolitan internationalization is absolutely true. I mean, when Judith Butler at Berkeley created this international consortium of critical theory programs, it's incredibly rich, 500 or so programs around the world. And the conference that I went to in Frankfurt in, I guess it was September, most of the papers were given by people who were not, you know, dead white males like me. I mean, they were people who... Almost already. See that, right? Turn 80. So, I mean, the people that were from Brazil and China and Ghana, they were really doing the work to connect the dots, but connect them in unexpected ways. It was quite exciting. And then I went to the conference that Peter organized shortly after at Harvard. All the eminent critical theory, all the people of my generation were there. And Axel made his point, which was the same point about how he had been wrong about ignoring, you know, climate change and how critical theory should go back to the issues of negatives. But what was fascinating, I said, the first group was like freshman orientation. The second was like a class reunion. And it's possible to have, critical theory has this capacity, and Western Marxism, broadly speaking, to transcend its origins. And if we see it not so much as a simple trajectory, a simple narrative, but as a debris field to be reconstellated. So, you know, somebody discovered that the racket theory stuff, which they didn't really do much with, has some relevance. That, you know, the world of Donald Trump is the world of racketeering. He's up for a RICO, you know, indictment in Georgia. So suddenly it becomes alive. Leo Lowenfeld's work, you haven't mentioned him at all, but you know, great influence in my own his work on Prophets of Deceit, all those techniques, we see them playing out. So there are these things that can be grabbed, and other things, well, not so much. The economic, there are a lot of people pushing critical theory in that direction today. Talking about it. Some people even argue that Adorno's late work was very much driven by Marxist notions of common fetishism. So there's a lot there, but not to be worshipped, not to be simply put in a glass cage, the way Adorno's little sort of monument in fact it is with his desk. Not to be seen as something outside, but rather as something who symbolizes. And so the simple message, I would say, from this is that critical theory and Western Marxism as topics for intellectual historians propels us in exciting ways. And this is true of many other topics. I mean, we haven't talked, for example, about theological issues. Many of the people here, a good number at least, did distinctions that had to do with theology. And we discovered today that theology, broadly speaking, is an enormously fascinating, rich, and complicated field for contemporary addressing deep and difficult issues. So, I think that's what we get out of this kind of energy, which I feel coming from this book. Home, the desire somehow to return home, and also the other romanticization of being in exile. These are then elevated to very, very flexible, semantically, we might say, slippery metaphors. And there is some sort of pushback when you say, well, wait a minute, I like the point that Alex made about Heine feeling the pain of exile. But the people who really have to go through the crap to somehow escape and then resettle. I mean, this is not easy, and sometimes it's really fatal. So it's not something that one can just quickly metaphorize. But it's, we might say, the flexibility of the term that makes it so useful. Talking about philosophy as homesickness, or the modern novel, all of that allows us to go back and forth to these levels. And if we forget that we're, somehow doing that, we then perhaps trivialize the real pain that real exiles feel. Kathy worked once on, my wife, on one of Edward Said's books, and made the point that there's a kind of bitter irony that he, in many cases, romanticized exile. He talked about it in Auerbach and various, as somehow a condition of, we might call it insight. You're out of the culture, but at the same time, he was deeply invested in getting those Palestinians in exile back home. So that there was a kind of tension between, the romanticization and the reality that being in exile, being in these stinking refugee camps, was hell. So I think that's something that we have that tension with.
Great, thank you. Yeah.
More competent, less of an imposter, and yet never reaching the level of an informant, but still, being able to contribute. So that's a kind of meta-level reflection. Very minor reflection is the issue of the diasporic model of the Jews as somehow a template for all other migration. I think that's really problematic. I mean, we do talk about Chinese diaspora, the Indian diaspora, maybe Black African diaspora, all of that. We ought to be very careful about simply assuming that there's an or type and that we're simply finding ways to make parallels or lack thereof. Every situation is different. And the issue that Eliot raised at the very beginning was also raised at the conference in Frankfurt by Didier Fassin, who you may know, a very, very important anthropologist, political theorist, one of the leaders of Médecins Sans Frontières, who was at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. And he made the point that the intellectual migration needs somehow to be connected to all of these other, and I take away Alan's point, exiles, emigrations, migrations, forced asylums, all of that stuff that is, alas, becoming more and more of reality. And the critical theorists at the beginning of the game didn't make that connection. It's incumbent upon us, I think, to think that through and to see what parallels or lack thereof we can talk about. So that's for his bringing in his own perspective. So thanks, really, Alan, for everything. I don't want to, I have a half hour, I don't want to take it all. I thought I would begin by reflecting first on substantive issues and then turn finally to pedagogical ones. It's fascinating, I must say, to see the dissemination of one's own, you know, sort of impact in such impressive ways. I mean, this is a very, very talented, accomplished, gifted group of people, and the work they've done. I mean, I have a bookshelf at home with the books of people at first dissertation, then second books, third books, some 4 or 5. It's now becoming a 2-layered shelf. It's really quite impressive. People have done a lot in the profession, but also, and this is crucial, people have done a lot, as we heard, I think Mike said it earlier, beyond the profession, using what skills they might have attained as intellectual historians, and made a difference in the world. I mean, it's very exciting that that's happened. So to see that, to feel it, you know, is really very, very gratifying. I mean, the only thing I can say about this conference that's negative is that no other conference will ever be quite as fascinating to me as this one has been. Now, substantively, we talked about methodology and such, and what we learned. And I think it's been very instructive to see how broad the approach is, how inclusive, how you know, people have gone their own way, and I like that. I mean, I've never thought of what we've created as a school. This is not the Berkeley School, certainly not the J School. There's nothing like, you know, Quentin Skinner and the people at Cambridge. It just wasn't, you know, in America, it's very hard to create that sense of cohesion. And I like that idea of 1,000 flowers blooming. And I think if I reflect now on my own trajectory, it's kind of scary to go back all the way. When I did the preface to this forthcoming book on magical nominalism, I actually introduced the notion via Said and Adorno of a late style. And I said this book was an example of a kind of intellectual historian's late style. And it's a kind of pretentious sort of thing to apply to oneself. You know, you talk about the composer's late style, but intellectual historians also have styles, as Hayden White has taught us, and sometimes they evolve. And what do I mean by that? What constitutes its lateness? And I realized that in all the previous work, and we've, you know, had occasion to talk about some of it, I basically carved at the joints. That is to say, in the first book, when I did my dissertation on the Frankfurt School, there was the Institute of Social Research, and there was a group of people who then became called the Frankfurt School. And what they did was labeled critical theory. And so I didn't invent any of that. I may have, you know, synthesized it, may have done a kind of paraphrastic duplication, synoptic duplication of their ideas, but I didn't have to create that. And I was able to show it to some of them, and they said, no, you got it wrong, or yes, you got it right. There was some sort of sense of my being the vehicle. And this was true of some of the later works, sort of biographical stuff on Siegfried Krakauer, a little book on Adorno. All of that had the quality of, well, it's a life, you know, a career. You sort of stick within those boundaries, occasionally add a little bit of your own. And then the larger thematic books, Marx in Totality, which tells you about totality, the book on experience, Songs of Experience, the book on visuality, oculocentrism, all of these may have been, let's say, not fully appreciated at the time by the people, sort of oculocentrism, denigration of vision, even, you know, more than the others, a kind of post-facto position, but nonetheless, they would have recognized themselves in it. They would have felt, oh yes, this is, you know, what I wanted to say. And I got back decent feedback from some of them. You know, Derrida, I wrote an article waiting for Derrida's response. He wrote me a letter which I couldn't read because the handwriting was so bad. but you know, at least there was some sense, yes, I had written about Derrida, yes, he thought it was okay. Same thing with Habermas in the book on Reason After It's Eclipsed. So there too, I'm basically working with an object or a field or something that's out there. Now this last book, Magical Nominalism, departed from that because no one here in this room, I think, knows what magical nominalism is. You might have heard magical realism. You might have known about the history of nominalism that Blumenberg and others have talked about. But it's not a concept, magical nominalism, that I found. I sort of imposed it. Basically, an intuition that there was something comparable to magical realism, that was magical nominalism, and then reading Blumenberg, Michael Allen Gillespie, and others who wrote about the nominalist tradition as crucial in the formation of modernity, I went back and saw that there was a subterranean tradition, which I wanted to call magical, and I have a lot of discussion of what I mean by magic. I had to learn a lot about what people said about magic, and discovered that against conventional nominalism, there was this other subterranean tradition. And I had a little bit of help from a Polish philosopher, Agata Bielak-Robson, who has talked about a specific Jewish nominalism, which I discovered late in the game, which in a way was perhaps congruent with what I was talking about as magical nominalism, but not perfectly the same. And she and I have had some, spirited discussions about whether or not magic or religion, magic or Jewish religion in particular, are the relevant categories. But basically, I created in this book a notion of magical nominalism. Now, the then, I would say, late style dimension of that was that I didn't begin by defining it. I didn't begin by saying this is the category, and these are the examples. This is the principle, these are the subsumptive cases. Because to do that would violate what magical nominalism is all about, which is we might say, resistance to the idea of conceptual subsumption, which conventional nominalism abets. Conventional nominalism says there are no real kinds in the world, there are no universals, we create them, it's human creation, even mathematics is created conventionally. Magical nominalism is less, we might say, subjectively imperialist, less interested in the domination of the concept, the subsumption of a particular under the general. And so it works, we might say, with paradigmatic examples, a bit like Kant's notion of a kind of sort of judgment, which is not a determined judgment, but reflective judgment, and operates with what Agamben calls different paradigms, by which he means not the Foucault, not the sense of the American philosopher of science, Tom Kuhn, but rather what Foucault meant by paradigms, which are parallel analogical examples which show a facet of something without being somehow cases of a larger principle. And then, of course, the task in this book, and this is where there's a gamble in a way, is to see what produces the concept or the idea or the term magical nominalism, produces it at the end of the game, not at the beginning but at the end. So when I go through a number of different, what I see as little moments, facets, it's a little bit like Benjamin on translation. Each translation has a little bit of a truth which is not there initially at the beginning, which can be discovered at the end, but rather is created cumulatively as facets as shown. And the first one is Benjamin's notion of a kind of magical notion of names. I mean, Benjamin really was, the word magic appears again and again and again. Sprachmagie, it's called sometimes, a kind of notion that a certain Adamic notion of the original name has a kind of power that conventional language doesn't have. So that they gave us a kind of insight into it. And then I focus on a very different discourse, the idea, the discourse of the event, the Ereignis, the événement, in mostly French thought, mostly post-structuralist French thought. So here the theorists of Lyotard, and Foucault, and Derrida, and Deleuze, and Badiou, who is a post-structuralist, all of whom put a great deal of weight on the idea of the event. And I also compare it with the notion of sublime historical experience, which I've dealt with before in the work of Frank Ankersmit and his colleague in Groningen, Ilko Runia. And all of these are attempts to see in a kind of chronological or, let's say, narrative form, ruptures, moments of strangeness, moments that interrupt, moments that are unsubsumable in a narrative, moments that create something new, the idea of the event as an advent, the idea of the event as something which is unrecuperable, the Ereignis, which may show something deeper, whether it be abysmal truth or being or God knows what else. They all have their own version of that. And I tried to see this as a kind of magical nominalist temporality, in which somehow there's something magical about the event. It's nominalist in the sense that it doesn't follow a general rule, it doesn't follow a principle, and yet it has a kind of transgressive meaning. So that was the sort of second moment. The third moment had to do with essentially aesthetic irrealism, to use Nelson Goodman's term, The editors of the book at Chicago said, "Realism, what does that mean?" So we put in the subtitle, "Aesthetic Reenchantment." I'm not so crazy about that, but that's what it ends up as. And here I look at Marcel Duchamp, who had a notion of pictorial nominalism, his own term. Thierry Didou, the great Belgian critic of Duchamp, has a whole book dedicated to pictorial nominalism. And here too, the ready-made produces a very interesting example of something that interrupts the discourse, the discourse of beauty and of art. It's complicated, whether it's conventional or magical. There's some magic in Duchamp, but he's also too cynical to be really interested in enchantment. But then I turn to Adorno, my old friend Teddy Adorno, and his notion of musical nominalism. I already published a piece to the New German Critique a few years ago. Musical nominalism. Now he has a very complicated attitude towards nominalism. He sees it as corrosive in a necessary way, but ultimately insufficient. But when it comes to aesthetic questions, there is a dialectic of form, of what we might call generic forms and nominalist examples. So each work is an example of, say, a romantic opera or whatever, but has its own uniqueness. And beyond that, in musical terms, there is a final, we might say, gesture of meaninglessness, in which something doesn't mean something else, isn't an example of something larger, has its own magical, if you want, moment, which produces an experience of uniqueness, particularity, whatever, which is unsubsumable and which has no other, you might say, outcome than its own, power. And at one point, maybe more than one, it compares to prayer. That there's a curious way in which music, like prayer, although there's some, attempt to make prayer functional, you need to pray for rain and the drought. Prayer is simply praise, as simply an expression of some sort of affirmation, of some sort of useless thing. I mean, God doesn't need to be praised, and yet we praise God. So there's that sense of music having that quality, and he's quite, I think, there's a theological, perhaps, dimension in all this. The third example is the idea of the photograph as also a magical novelist phenomenon. I've written quite a bit about photography over the years, and here I differentiate between photography as an institution, with all the things we know about material support, institutional context, the way in which it functions socially, and the specific photograph. And here Roland Barthes' notion, especially of the punctum, in his discussion in Camera Lucida, serves as a way to get at this way in which we're wounded by, we're punctured. There's a quality in certain photographs of surprise, which disturb, we might say, the expected, what he calls studium, which is the cultural meaning of the photograph. And it has a quality which is unique for each of us, but also perhaps for each photograph, or certain photographs. And there are other connections with the event, the idea of the photograph as an event in time, cutting time, a specific moment in time, not like a movie. And also even the photograph as a proper name. And Martin Zale, the German philosopher, so the Frankfurt School is a very interesting book on the photograph as a name. So this is the third large, or maybe fourth large section of the book. And then I have a kind of inconclusive conclusion, where I turn back to an issue I raised in the discussion of conventional nominalism, which has to do with sovereignty, as in a way, affect normal notions of sovereignty, Carl Schmitt in particular, of conventional nominalism. There's nothing out there except the will of the supreme power. And there is a great connection, which we can go into at some length, between conventional nominalism and the importance of the will, which begins with William de Ockham. That's, went back to medieval nominalism. It was the importance of God's will rather than the reason that God had to follow that is the initiating, let's say, religious source of nominalism. And what the magical nominalists, almost all of them do, is to attack sovereignty. They're all critical of the idea of a single subject with the power to control, the power to somehow impose his will on the world. So the book tries to do all, it's a kind of weird book. It's, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. But simply from a methodological point of view, it's a kind of, I don't know if risk is the right word, but it goes out on a limb because it doesn't carve history at the joints. It doesn't, none of these people would be able to say, oh yes, I recognize myself in it. So maybe it's my own will being imposed. But on the other hand, it gives me, I think, some sort of license at the end to have a style that is more, let's say, fragmented, more out of control. And I allow the material to tell me what, it's saying rather than my coming up with, I think, a priori model. So that's just a kind of coming attraction to the book. It's hard to sort of sell it, this book because it is a kind of, I think, strange exercise. So that's just, I think, it was Alice who talked about my method and substance. This is a kind of way to say, never feel that you are trapped by a method. There's always something new that you can try. A lot of people have done that. You can move ahead in ways that are, I think, experimental, even at the end of the career. All right, so that's substance. Let me turn to pedagogy. Now, it seems to me that there are, and I didn't really thematize this until perhaps this conference, 3 models of being a graduate student instructor. One and here with apologies to Max Weber. The first we might call traditional. The second we'll call charismatic. The third rational, maybe rational legal too strong. The traditional model. So, the professor is always Professor J. It's always a kind of slightly distant, aloof figure, transmitting knowledge, the authority of the office, the authority of having read more books than anybody else in the room. The kind of sense of training in a kind of mentorial way, the way a master trains, journeymen and apprentices. A very, very, I would say, vertical model. And I must say that on reflection, my own dissertation advisor, H.C. Hughes, was pretty much in this model. I mean, he was, enabling and certainly was, very supportive of the work I was doing, but this was clearly a hierarchical model. I mean, he was a very busy guy with lots of other students and, political career and, came from an aristocratic American background in a way. And there was no sense of, I would say, horizontality between us, not for a long time at least. So this was one model, and it has its virtues. You can have the edible rebellion against it, the way, say, Dominic LeCapra did against Stewart, but, you could also have, a respectful attitude, but it keeps the game going. Then there's the charismatic model, and here there is a much more intimate, much more emotionally laden, maybe even erotic dimension, where what you create is not a distance relationship, but almost cult-like closeness, where the teacher becomes somehow a guru, or whatever the term might be, the kind of Georgia Christ version of, some sort of weird cult. In America, we don't do this too much, but it does happen. I think of Avital Ronell and her crowd at NYU. It's a dangerous game to play. You end up sometimes with too much, I don't know what, too much involvement. And what you end up with are disciples. Then the third model, which I would, assume Olive Weber is the more rational, communicative model, is the Habermasian in me, is the model in which you very quickly move from, this hierarchical thing to something that's, moving towards horizontality, moving towards treating the people you're teaching as potential equals. So what you don't want in that model are disciples, acolytes, people who keep the flame of your whatever burning, but rather colleagues. You don't want this how you want colleagues. And you want people who are able to argue with you. And my great example here was Fritz Ringer, who was at Harvard when I was a graduate student, later went on to other places, junior faculty member. And Fritz was much more than Stewart, really engaged. We'd go out for a beer. He was, a younger guy, and he just liked to argue. And in fact, years later, he and I had actually an argument in print. He was a disciple of Bourdieu, it turned out, and I didn't quite buy into that. And we had a kind of back and forth, and I think it was Theory and Society, journal I was involved with many years ago. Very friendly, but nonetheless, you know, we argue. And so I've always felt encouraged by students or former students who become colleagues who argue. I think that's a model, and I think, you know, this conference really shows that, of a kind of fairly I mean, I don't want to be overly idealized, I'm, you know, still, you know, sitting here and you're sitting there, but nonetheless. But if there is an emulation, that's what I would like to do. Now, having said that, I have to finish on a kind of slightly silly note, maybe not so silly. How do I, you know, I mean, I have all those books, so I know the substance of what you've done as scholars, those of you who are scholars. And I've learned a great deal about what those of you who are not scholars have done. What do I know about your teaching? Well, I went to that eminently scientific site online called Rate My Professor. All the names have been changed to protect the innocent and make the guilty. Now, first of all, it's an impressive, you know, it's very, who the hell knows what, but it's quite fascinating what people say. And so I'm going to read, without embarrassing people directly, some of the comments, so I could go on, and I think will give you a flavor of how people in this room are perceived as professors. All right, one begins, X is an amazing prof, interested in how her students are doing and always willing to give feedback or help. Very passionate about the subject. Of course, requires a lot of work, but if you read the textbook and pay attention in classes, stay active in discussion, you will do well. Always capitalized. Always recommend any of her classes' favorite prof at University X. That starts pretty well. Another one. Professor X is a gem. He's truly passionate about both the material and the students. He'll stay after class and talk about the class or philosophy or just life. He'll legitimately ask you how you're doing. He's among the most empathetic and kind people I've ever had the pleasure to meet. The class actually changed my life thanks to him. No, there's a lot of reading. 8 textbooks, not including all the other texts on Blackboard. If you haggle him enough, though, he will have a party at the end of the semester. Pretty good guy. Pretty good guy. He was a great professor who sometimes played one of his many instruments for us at the beginning of class. We were assigned reading from the textbook and historical documents before each class. We also read 2 books and wrote papers on them along with the midterm and final. We also had the occasional pop quiz, which was easy if you actually read. I gotta say, this man has a magnetic aura. As do his classes. Do not be fooled by his reserved demeanor. Many mistake this as hostility and judgment. He is actually one of the most generous and gentle professors I've ever had. Guides conference with a light touch and incredible skill. Take any class with him, he will make it worth your time. Professor X's teaching style is hard to get used to at first because he is so empathetic, so emphatic, and talks so quickly. But I now would consider him one of the best professors I've ever had. His classes are lots of work, but absolutely worth it. I've never learned more in the class than I did with him, plus he looks like a sober version of Robert Smith. Now, I think this Robert Smith, for those who don't know, is a member of the British rock group Cure. Anybody know Robert Smith? Okay, there's another one. These are all true, but if Ben Stiller were Hegel, he'd be Professor X. Laid back, funny, and seems to know everything. Here's how a lecture goes. He starts off on some riff, and then he's just talking to you. And if you're taking notes, all of a sudden you look down at 11:45. That's a perfect lecture. Really easy to talk to outside of class, too. And these are the few final ones that I love. He should retire, poor guy. So old. Oh, so very, very old. And alarmingly so. I was afraid something might happen each class. It's so sad to see old teachers. He must enjoy it, I suppose. Very busy guy, apparently. Overall distracted and, oh yeah, old. And then the next one says, I've had him for several classes. First, he's not that old. Not old at all, only by ignorant 20-something standards. He is, however, quite busy, but still helpful. A good teacher with a comprehensive knowledge of the subject matter and the ability to convey it effectively. Also a nice guy. Certainly not bad looking, but no George Clooney. And then the final one, very short, but I think about as sweet as it gets. Great. He did an interpretive dance about the Ottoman Empire for us. Nor will I ask that person to do that dance. All right, so I don't know how to follow that. So in other words, you know, you guys have got it. I mean, these are great. I kill for these recommendations. So let me just end really with that. I don't know how to come and say thanks, and we'll make a deal that if I'm around in 10 years, we all come back. Why don't we do it again?
Hi Marty, George Santos here. I hear that your former students are celebrating your 80th birthday by throwing a conference in your honor. I wanted to add my congratulations and tell you how much I've admired your work over the years. I too am one of your grateful students. In particular, I wanted to thank you for the virtues of mendacity on lying in politics, which became my Bible. You are the inspiration for all politicians who know that varnishing the truth is part of our job description, and that the self-anointed honest politicians are the real hypocrites. You are my hero, Marty. Happy 80th birthday and many more to come. Love, George. Marty, your students love you and they send you this message with all the love in the world. Bye.